I'm from Irish Aid, from the Humanitarian Unit, and I suppose that's more the perspective that I'm bringing in relation to this discussion today. Obviously, DCD is a large wing of the Department of Foreign Affairs, and there's lots of engagement at, I suppose, different levels, at our mission level as well, in terms of some support to the humanitarian side. But from for this particular purpose of this event today, we're sort of bringing what we're doing in the Humanitarian Unit more specifically to this discussion. Just wanted to start off with our humanitarian policy, which of course drives everything we're supposed to be doing, and I just picked out some of the key principles from that policy. There's 16 in relation to this policy, which was updated in 2015, and at that time, I suppose, as was mentioned, the sector was getting very geared up for the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit, but even at that stage, at 2015, issues around the importance of first responders, the need for individual and differentiated responses, vulnerable groups that are agents for change. These kind of issues were all coming through as part of the update in the policy. We also recognised the central role of the UN in terms of humanitarian work, the authority of the Committee of the Red Cross, and then of course the important role of the NGOs in providing assistance. The policy has 4 objectives. I'm just picking on 2 that I felt, again, were more relevant to today's discussion. And the first one is around providing humanitarian assistance, but as part of that, we're committing very much to putting disaster-affected people at the centre of our response. And we had acknowledged also that equitable attention is needed for the vulnerable, and particularly women and girls. And through our work, there would be a gender and GBV focus. And then the second policy objective was around trying to demonstrate our leadership and partnership for effective international humanitarian response. And again, within that, we were committing to promoting good humanitarian donorship, which is around ensuring that implementing partners are involving beneficiaries and partners as part of their response. So I suppose that's just to set the scene a little bit in terms of how we, this very important issue around actors, local actors, was reflected in the policy. Then in terms of the Grand Bargain, Ireland signed up to it in December 2016, and for obvious reasons we were very aware of the financing gaps in the humanitarian system, and in acknowledgement obviously that efficiencies could be made. I think importantly though, it was very much in line with a lot of the current work practices that were underway already within the Humanitarian Unit and Irish Aid, particularly around increasing cash-based programming, the whole humanitarian development nexus, multi-annual frameworks, and then also on earmarking or core funding. So that work was already underway, and we felt it very much fit in terms of signing up to the Grand Bargain. The Grand Bargain Workstreams, I won't go into too much detail here, but I think there's an acknowledgement that generally progress has been uneven. Certainly agencies aren't in a position to follow all of the 10 work streams. What Ireland has done is we're engaging more with Workstream 7 and Workstream 8, which is around multi-year planning and reducing earmarking. And I think partly for the reasons that we felt we had a bit of experience to share and lessons to share around the unearmarking or core funding to humanitarian agencies, but also then we wanted to learn a little bit more about the multi-annual funding to partners. So that was sort of the rationale. But we are following the work streams, the other work streams, and I do think we have a particular interest in the localisation one, partly because of, I suppose, our focus on partnerships. But we're very keen to see what's arising out of the different work streams in terms of the research and the lessons being learned, and then to try and apply them through the work. Localisation, the call for supporting humanitarian responders more locally, it's obviously not new, as Rachel mentioned, and it's embedded in a number of other policy frameworks that Ireland has signed up to, notably the Good Humanitarian Donorship, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and of course the World Humanitarian Summit. I think from Irish Aid's perspective, we see localisation as important in terms of recognising, respecting and strengthening leadership and decision making of the local responders. And for us, it's not just about the funding and the financing, it is about the quality of that funding, as was mentioned, and I think also about a sort of a broader engagement around how that funding is used and the partnership with the local responders. In terms of, I suppose, how we feel we're meeting some of the localisation commitments in general, first off, I mean, notwithstanding the discussion that's, I think, being had or currently underway around what is a local responder and also what is that issue of direct funding, or as directly as possible. We are trying, I think, to address, make greater use of some of these funding tools, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail, which are supposed to try and allow for accessibility of local responders more easily. We're also trying to complement the local coordination mechanisms that were mentioned as well. And then we're also trying to increase our multi-annual funding to partners. So I suppose that's just by a broad overview of how we're trying to do it. And then in terms of championing gender equality in that, we're coming from, I think, the premise that you're not going to have humanitarian effectiveness unless gender equality is addressed through that, and that the success of this particular work stream around localisation will require the meaningful engagement of women's organisations and women's groups. So if that doesn't happen, obviously the work stream, what's arising out of it, won't be successful. I suppose what we're trying to do this work through both our policy engagement and through our funding approach to a number of our different partners. And I suppose specifically in relation to the policy side, there are a number of initiatives which we are engaged in, have signed up to. A number of you will be familiar with the call to action on protection of GBV in emergencies, which was launched in 2013 and was an attempt to try and fundamentally shift the way gender and GBV is addressed in humanitarian operations. And within that, it very clearly says that wherever possible, that prevention and response should be undertaken in collaboration with local partners on the ground, local systems, and local women's organisations are essential partners to that. And we have to report on this this call to action initiative on an annual basis, and we'd see that as an important way of continuing to engage on this and to reinforce the commitments under localisation for this purpose. The UN Security Council Resolution 1325, again, it was adopted in 2000, and again, it recognises, I think, the particularly, adverse effects of conflict on women, and it was an attempt to try and ensure that women's groups were very much involved in the relief and recovery pillar of the Women, Peace and Security resolution. And Ireland has a national action plan to support this, which runs from 2015 to 2018. And again, it's around trying to improve the engagement of women in the protection of women in these kind of humanitarian contexts through targeted funding, which we're aiming to do. And it's also around empowering women in fragile contexts through building civil society organisations, and particularly women's organisations. And again, we have to report on that to a monitoring group of our National Action Plan, and we would see that again as an opportunity to reinforce the commitments made under localisation and engaging women's organisations to address issues around conflict in humanitarian contexts. Just wanted to mention in this context too, around policy engagement, we do have a relationship or a partnership with the International Rescue Committee, but it's particularly focused on gender and GBV in humanitarian settings. And a pillar of this support is around policy and policy engagement. So we'll be supporting the IRC to develop policy briefs to engage with donors and agencies around better, more effective and coordinated approaches to GBV in humanitarian settings. And again, this is very much informed by learning on the ground, and policy briefs would be shared with donors and other partners at fora such as the Commission on Status of Women and, for example, at the UNGA. So again, it's an opportunity to try and engage at that higher level around these issues of bringing in women and women's organisations to very important humanitarian work. I suppose through some of our particular funding approaches then, was on your slide, I think, Rachel, there was some reference there to the country-based pool funds. And Ireland has been moving in the direction of supporting them, increasing our contributions, I should say, to those. We would see that it very much fulfills localisation commitments because it does allow for local agencies, local organisations to access those funds. Now, I suppose within that, we are trying very clearly to see what's allocated to a local organisation, but I suppose more broadly then, or more specifically, I should say, what's being allocated to women's organisations from those funds. And we will be tracking that, we will be trying to verify that, and we would, through our discussions, through our engagement, we will be asking how the gender marker, for example, is applied. And one thing I suppose that is quite clear is there can be quite a large percentage of funds from these country-based pool funds going to address women. So I suppose that issue of maybe women-centred, but it's maybe not quite as clear as to how they are being women-led and what is actually going through women's organisations specifically. So I think that's something that we can maybe bolster in terms of our engagement with these country-based pool funds. There has been a little bit of work done on this in 2017, and it is interesting to note that overall about 50% of the funding is going to international NGOs and 30% to local NGOs. And then depending on the fund, you would have there may be an increase on that in terms of the amount of funding going towards local NGOs and indeed addressing women's issues. So we are currently sitting on about 13 of those pool funds, or contributing, I should say, to 13 of those funds in countries like Sudan, Somalia, South Sudan, Iraq and Yemen. And we are sitting on the advisory board of 2 of them from the Humanitarian Unit, that would be Lebanon and Jordan, and then the Ethiopian one as well. And again, it's engaging there and trying to see what exactly is happening with those funds in terms of access by local organisations. And as I say, more specifically then in terms of what's going towards women's organisations. The START Fund is another pool fund, which again we are contributing to. It's an NGO fund, and it allows both international and local NGOs to access funding at that local level to address emergencies. Again, we feel it meets the commitments we've made around localisation. It tracks gender in terms of what percentage of the funds support women and girls. Perhaps we need a little bit more information on the organisations the women's organisations specifically, which are in receipt of the funds. They've identified most recently that over 50% is going to local organisations, but again they're hoping that maybe up to 25% further by the end of 2020 will actually be clearly going to partners and not necessarily being subcontracted through local partners. So again, it'll be something that we'll be monitoring. One of our other partners, as set out in the policy, is the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. That's a key partner for us. We are increasing core contributions, and we've also just moved towards a multi-annual framework for the Committee of the Red Cross, and again that forms part of one of the work streams around trying to increase that multi-annual funding to try and I suppose provide longer term funding, opportunities for longer term funding. And then through our international NGOs, I suppose specifically there's been a number of developments in terms of trying to address both localisation and I suppose more specifically women under that. In 2017, for the first time, we moved towards multi-annual funding for our humanitarian partners that are working in emergencies, and we would see that, I suppose, as allowing or improving perhaps opportunities for planning to take account of gender dynamics. So we would hope to see that partners who are in receipt of longer term funding will actually then be in a position to plan better for all its work, and including to that is work through or with women's organisations. The development and humanitarian funding streams for the first time have been more closely linked, and again that's an attempt to try and I suppose have better outcomes ultimately from work that's supported through both the development and the humanitarian funding, touching again on the humanitarian development nexus. And again, we would see that allows, I suppose, women who often play such a key role in moving from the more humanitarian side of things to the development side, from crisis to stability, and we would see that would be an opportunity to allow that to happen. And finally, for the first time, we've also been tracking the flow of funds. So actually seeing what's been given at the HQ level and seeing exactly how much of it reaches down to partners. That's an exercise that we've undertaken for the first time this year. And also we're looking at we've always been looking at the partners, but just to see exactly what's coming through in terms of maybe women's groups more specifically. Through this appraisal process with our NGO partners, we've always looked at gender and GBV criteria. I think it's becoming stronger now because of the commitments made at the Grand Bargain. We've always assessed, I suppose, gender dynamics and looked at partnership policies. And I think they're becoming, increasingly more important as we consider issues around localisation, really to understand how does an international NGO work with partners and organisations on the ground. Is it a real partnership, or is it more a subcontracting type of arrangement? Sex disaggregated data is becoming more important, and again, that's perhaps more of a potentially a women-centred as opposed to women-led, but it does allow us to see the kind of funding that, or the outcomes from the funding that's being dispersed. And then capacity building through our partners, again, very important, and I think another focus of the localisation commitments, where we're looking at more of investment in local partners on the ground. But I think there's scope for additional refining and thinking through this in the context of women's organisations and women's-led organisations. Just to mention, I suppose, our gender and protection portfolio, because that's a standalone programme. I mentioned the International Rescue Committee earlier, who were doing some policy work, but we would also be supporting them for work around the Horn of Africa, around GBV and gender and empowerment, and I suppose specifically around building the capacity of women's responders, local responders, for their work. They've just actually undertaken a piece of work around localisation and localising the GBV response. And it's quite interesting in terms of actions for both agencies and for donors. And one of the recommendations for donors would be around trying to incentivise local or international NGOs to work in more, I suppose, clear partnership with women's organisations, and not to be sort of seeing them as an unequal partner in programmes around gender and gender-based violence. In terms of a commitment around strengthening the capacity of local partners, we would also be supporting the UN's what's called GenCap, which is a gender capacity programme, which deploys skilled personnel around gender and humanitarian contexts. And they would be working with international NGOs on the ground, but also with local NGOs on the ground. And again, I think that whole capacity strengthening is critical as we, I suppose, discuss some of the challenges around localisation and working with local partners. So we've been funding them for the last couple of years, and we'll continue to do so. The challenges around localisation, and I suppose specifically for gender, I mean, they're kind of interconnected in many respects. The lack, I suppose, of gender-specific explicit references in some of the wording around gender, the Grand Bargain, I think, was a challenge, and I think that was acknowledged by the group, the Friends of Gender group, as part of the GB, the Grand Bargain, a sense that perhaps it could have been more explicit through the Grand Bargain. The sequencing of work streams, again, could be problematic, not just for local organisations more generally, but I think also for women's organisations. Multi-annual funding work stream, if that's not continuing apace, that will have challenges for example, the localisation work stream. And then I think there's been a number of concerns raised around the time constraints, the capacity limitations, the efficiencies of local partners, and again, the implications of that potentially, and probably most likely, even more problematic for women's organisations. A number of them potentially could be valid, but I think, for example, issues around capacity limitations, the country-based pool funds, part of their mandate is to carry out capacity assessments and see how local organisations are in a position to carry out humanitarian work. And there's scope there for training and I think preparedness, and they're the kind of issues that we would be hoping our international partners and through the country-based pool funds are addressing. Reputational risk around local partners. Can they maintain independence and not be biased and not have political affiliations? Again, I think that's something that we would hope the core standard will be able to address, and there will be funding and work and training around that as part of, for example, the Federation of the Red Cross, working with local responders at a humanitarian level. And then another, I suppose, issue that's been thrown up around possible challenges for localisation would be the use of domestic NGOs versus the local NGOs. And a sense that maybe the taxpayer or the funders want to see NGOs that they're, I suppose, more familiar with. And I think what we have to try and do there is good communication around what this is all about, why we were working more through local NGOs and local partners. I think it's an evolving situation, and I think a lot of the unintended consequences need to be addressed. We need to be open to seeing how these challenges are going to be highlighted and addressed as that evolves, and we'll see what issues are coming out of the work streams. And I think a key issue really is, I suppose, around being context specific, because I think in some countries there is more capacity there among local responders than in others, and the conflict situation also specific in one area vis-a-vis obviously another. So I think context specificity is an important one to bear in mind as we I suppose look at localisation and consider the issues associated with it. Just have a couple more, and I suppose that just brings to the issue of building the evidence around this. And again, Irish Aid will be funding some pieces of research that have been undertaken with TROCRA. We'll also with ALNAP, we're supporting a piece of work around a guide to evaluating GBV interventions. And I think also whatever research is coming through, that it would be very much informing ultimately the delivery of better aid and better assistance for men, women and children. And communication, I suppose, ultimately, this is always something that we're very conscious of in the department. It's not, I suppose, ultimately the goal isn't about efficiencies, this whole process, this localisation process. It is more about reducing the suffering of people on the ground through being more efficient. And ultimately it's trying to communicate those results and what's happening for the direct benefit ultimately of men, women and children in terms of the work that we're trying to do. So I'll just leave it at that for a moment. Thanks.